Hello and welcome everyone to today's tutorial on learning C++ from the scratch. In today's tutorial, we are going to talk more about the if condition in C++, where in the previous tutorial, we talked about the if-else structure and the if-else-if-else structure. But the thing is that we can also use the if condition without the else part, which means we can only use an if structure like this. And we do this when we want only to trigger a block of code when our condition is satisfied. Otherwise, we don't want to trigger anything inside our if condition. Where in the previous structure, we were having a multiple root and we were going to trigger one of the roots depending on our condition. But this time, either we trigger something or not. That's it. So let's jump into an example so that we can get the main idea in a better way. So here's an example. As you can see, we have if-else condition here. And if the condition is true, then we are going to trigger this code over here. And if it's not true, then we are going to trigger this code over here, which says welcome inside else. And currently it is true. So when we run our code, what you will see is that welcome inside if, so it triggered this code first and didn't trigger this second code over here, and then next we move on in our program and trigger what's outside our if-else code. So this structure will trigger only one of this code. But what if we only want to trigger a code when a condition is met, otherwise we don't want to trigger anything? Well, in this case, what we can do is delete this part over here. So now, what will happen is that if our condition is true, it will trigger what's inside this if condition. Otherwise, it will not trigger anything inside our if. So let's run our program. Currently, the condition is true. So it trigger what's inside the if. But if our condition were false, what we will see is that it will not trigger anything inside our if condition. Now we are outside. So it move on without triggering anything in our if condition. So that's the first topic that we want to talk about in this tutorial. And the second thing that we want to talk about in our if condition tutorial is that currently when our condition here is true, it will run what's inside our if condition. But if it's false, it will not run anything. But actually, we can have more than condition inside these brackets. So example, if we have another condition here, bool condition, for example, 2 equal to true. And now let's turn the first condition to true. Now, what we want to do is that we want to check the first condition and the second condition. And if both our first and second condition are true, then we are going to run the code inside our if. But if one of them are false, then we are not going to run the code inside our if. And we can do that using an operator called ampersand, or this character over here, which we call AND operator. And then followed it by our second condition, which in this case, condition number 2, and check if the second condition is true as well. And if both condition 1 and condition 2 are true, then we are going to run the code inside here. And we can read this double ampersand by AND. So if condition 1 is true and condition 2 is true, if condition 1 is true and condition 2 is true, then we are going to run the code inside our if. So let's try our code right now. As you can see, welcome inside if. So the code inside our if condition were triggered because both of our two conditions were true. But if one of them were false, then what we will see is that the code inside the if were ignored and didn't run. So for the code inside our if condition to run, we need both conditions to be true. So that's what our logical operator AND do. But actually we have another operator which we called OR operator. This one over here. This one over here only need one condition to be true. If one of our two conditions are true, then it will run the code inside our if. Let's check it out. As you can see, will come inside if. So it triggered the code inside our if condition even though one of our conditions were false. It will only ignore the code inside our if both of our conditions were false. So if we turn this to false and try to run our program, what we will see is now it didn't trigger the code inside our if because both of our conditions were false. And actually we can shortcut this by doing this as well, by deleting equal true and equal true on the condition 2 as well. This means the same thing where it will check if condition 1 were true and condition 2 were true. So as you can see, it will not trigger anything. It's doing the same thing, but if one of our conditions were true, it will trigger because the OR operator over here, we called it OR operator, only need one true condition for it to trigger the code inside our if, as you can see over here. Now, here's another thing that I want to talk about. Before, when we have our one condition, of course, we can do this thing on two conditions, but to make the example simple, I will explain this with one condition. We said that this have the same meaning as checking if our condition is true. Am I right? So if this is true, it will trigger the code inside it. And we can change this by saying, for example, we want to check if the condition is false instead of true. And if the condition only is false, then we are going to trigger the code inside it. Currently, the condition is true, but we are checking if it is false. So, is the condition false? No. So, it's not going to trigger the code inside it because the condition is not false. But if our condition becomes false over here, now it will trigger the code inside it. Will come inside if. But if we delete this part, now it's going to check if the condition is true and will not trigger the code inside it until our condition turns to true, as you can see over here. We also have a shortcut way of writing equal false. We can check if the condition is false by putting an exclamation mark over here. This reverses the operation. Now, instead of checking if it is true, now it is checking if it is false. And now, our condition is false. And when we write the exclamation mark before this condition, now it's checking, is the condition equal to false? If it is, run this code over here. So let's check our code right now. As you can see, it did run the code inside our if condition because it is checking if it is equal to false or not. So we have the AND operator. If both our conditions are true, then it will only trigger the code inside our if condition and treat the whole statement as true. But if one of our conditions are false, then our whole statement will be false and will not trigger anything inside our if. But the OR operator only need one true condition. So if we have both true, if we have two conditions and both of them are true, then it will give us a true. And if we have one true and the other one is false, it will also give us true and trigger the code inside our if condition. But only and if only both our conditions are false, then it will give us a false as a return and will not trigger anything inside our if condition. And that's it about today's tutorial. Thank you very much for watching and see you next time.